Hi, my name is Jennifer Tompkins, and I am the Director of Community History and Education with the Grand Rapids Asia Pacific Foundation. I'm delighted to share the story of the Nisei soldiers of World War II with you here today, and I would like to thank the Grand Rapids Public Library for giving GRAPH this opportunity to share one of the most extraordinary stories from our community's history. The Nisei soldiers, or the Japanese American soldiers, I may use those terms interchangeably. We're talking about the same group of people. Nisei is a Japanese term. It means second generation. And the Japanese American soldiers of World War II were made up of second generation Japanese Americans who were the sons of Japanese immigrants. The Japanese immigrants would be Issei, which would be first generation. Another term that you may hear is Kibe, which is a second generation Japanese American who studied in Japan and therefore had a mastery of the Japanese language. I hope that you enjoy this presentation, and thank you for your interest in learning more about the Nisei soldiers of World War II and their connections to West Michigan. Okay, the Japanese American soldiers of World War II and their connections to West Michigan. The Japanese American soldiers of World War II, or the Nisei soldiers of World War II, served in 3 units: the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and in military intelligence service. The Nisei soldiers of World War II in the 100th and the 442nd, they became a combined unit, and this unit is the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history. They were awarded over 18,000 medals. 9,000 of them were Purple Hearts, which is what you receive if you are injured or killed in action. 7 Distinguished Presidential Unit Citations, and 21 Medals of Honor. Only one of those Medals of Honors was actually issued during that time period. The other 20 were issued later in the 90s by President Bill Clinton. The MIS received 1 Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism, but their award medals can be misleading. The MIS history is not well known and has only recently been researched, and that is because of the high confidentiality that their war efforts involved. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. But in 2011, all 3 units received the Congressional Gold Medal. Okay, so you have the Nisei soldiers of World War II. They're the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history. There have been multiple movies made about this group of men. They have monuments throughout the world. The monuments that we see here, we see the bronze plaque. We see the statue of the 442nd's shoulder patch, which is Lady Liberty holding a flame of justice. These monuments are in France and in Italy, and the photo of the multiple flags that you see there, that is in Briere, France. And once a year, they have a 442nd, basically a day to remember the 442nd and their liberation of that town, and also the liberation or the rescue of the Lost Battalion. And they actually will reenact some of the battles. And it doesn't matter that it's French citizens that are doing it. because it's the spirit of the tale, and it's the incredible bravery and heroism that is honored. And it's just, it's always amazing to me that individuals from across the Atlantic and in other parts of the world know the story of these men, and yet many in their own country, and especially here in Michigan, have never heard of the Nisei soldiers. They've never heard of the Nisei soldiers, even though there's a building right in downtown Battle Creek, the Hart Dole Inouye Federal Center, that is actually named after a Nisei soldier. It's named after Senator Dan Inouye, who, while serving with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was injured. And at the time, that building was the Percy Jones Memorial Hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan. And the other two individuals it's named after is Philip Hart and Bob Dole. And we'll get into that story a little bit later in the presentation, but it's just worth noting that something as large as this giant building is named after one of these gentlemen, and yet the connections are just not made. Okay, so talking about the three units, again, it's the 100th Infantry Battalion, and then the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. And diving a little bit deeper, so the 100th Infantry Battalion, separate because they were not attached to any other units, their motto, which they insisted upon, was "Remember Pearl Harbor." The 100th Infantry Battalion was made up entirely of Hawaii National Guardsmen from the 298th and 299th Infantry units. So for them, Pearl Harbor was very personal because this happened in their backyard. And many of the men in this unit actually were assisting the war effort during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So just because they're the country of their ancestors was responsible for the bombing, in their hearts, they were 100% American. And when they were given the opportunity to fight, they took it, because at this point in time, Asian Americans were allowed to serve in the military, but if they served in the military, they were cooks, clerks, or mechanics. They were not combat troops. And so this was actually, they viewed it as an opportunity to prove not only that they were American, but prove that they were just as good as any American. And so when they went into combat, which was in September of 1943, they actually became known as the Purple Heart Battalion because of their heroism and their eagerness to prove themselves. They suffered extremely high casualty rates. Now, the 100th Battalion can be credited somewhat for the creation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, partly because of the exemplary fighting record of the 100th. The U.S. government decided to create an all Japanese American segregated unit that would have both Hawaii and mainland Japanese Americans enlisted. And the War Department put out a call for volunteers. They were looking for 1,500 from Hawaii and 3,000 from the mainland to serve. 10,000 from Hawaii answered the call, while only 1,200 from the mainland did. This is mainly due to the fact of the incarceration of Japanese Americans on the mainland, whereas in Hawaii, the well, just the vast numbers made it almost impossible to intern the Japanese population there. And so the feelings of these two groups towards this opportunity were very different. But with that said, it has just the desire to serve, even though your families were interned, is something that is hard to explain, but something that tells you a little bit about who these men were. The next slide will show you another example of what the soldiers, a little bit about the soldiers. Okay, so here, the image that you see is the yellow arm with the blood red sword. This was the original arm patch for the 442nd, and it was to symbolize the yellow race taking up the defense of the United States. So you have the red, white, and blue with the yellow arm of the yellow race. Needless to say, the men of the 442nd found this to be very offensive. Fortunately, there was a gifted artist in the 442nd, and Sergeant Miyamoto, here you see there on the right, is credited with designing the arm patch emblem that we have all come to know as being attached to the 442nd, and that is Lady Liberty holding the torch of freedom. Now, the Military Intelligence Service is there's not nearly as much information on this group of men, just for the simple fact that what they were doing during the war, it was highly classified, and the records are just not as easily accessible. But they served in predominantly the Pacific Theater and at home, but they did serve in all theaters of the war. And what they did was, as I had mentioned the word Kibe earlier, many of the members of this unit were Kibe. They were American citizens, but they were educated in Japan, and many of them had gone through the Japanese Imperial Army's equivalent of the ROTC. So they had mastered both the military vocabulary and also the Japanese vocabulary. They are credited with shortening the war in the Pacific by 2 years, saving countless lives. And this was according to General MacArthur's, one of his aides. And it's just amazing to have accomplished such an amazing feat, not just for this country, but for humanity. And yet no one knows what you have done. And you've done this all while many of the families of these men were incarcerated back home. Additionally, they are responsible for the demise of Admiral Yamamoto. They had intercepted radio calls that outlined that basically they outlined when his They are responsible for the demise of Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They had intercepted a radio call that gave the details of an upcoming event where he would be inspecting troops at a certain time, at a certain place, and they knew where he'd be heading to and where he'd be headed from. So they were able to relay that information, and then the Americans could intercept his plane with American fighter planes, and he was shot down with that information. And it's just interesting because Admiral Yamamoto was the architect for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into the war and which had devastating ramifications for Japanese Americans. And it's just ironic that a Japanese American is responsible for bringing about his demise. Okay, now the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, it's a little hard for some people to understand, and it took me a little while to grasp it as well. It's not something that is commonplace today, and it wasn't really commonplace at that time either. So this was an all-encompassed unit. They had everything that they needed. They had an artillery battalion. They had a medical detachment. They had a combat engineer unit. And so they were able to move very quickly, and they were also able to stay a segregated unit for the most part. And here you can see that the 100th Infantry Battalion would actually go on to become the 1st Battalion of the 442nd. However, because of their exemplary war record and out of respect for what they had done, the 100th was able to keep their designation. Therefore, the 442nd had a 100th Battalion, a 2nd Battalion, and a 3rd Battalion. Additionally, they had the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. And then, as I said, they had a combat engineer unit, and they even had their own Army band. Okay, so we talked about the organization of the units, but now we're going to talk about who were the Nisei, who were the men that made up these units. We had mentioned earlier that they came from both the mainland and from Hawaii, but you'll see that these two groups, they shared Japanese ancestry, but their geography, the culture from where they came from, and the population density of these two groups brought about very different perspectives of how they would see the world. The Nisei in Hawaii were basically the children of what you could best describe as being sharecroppers. Cheap labor coming from Asia was banned in the mainland due to exclusionary immigration acts. However, Hawaii being a territory, those immigration acts did not apply. Therefore, many people from Japan, China, the Philippines, they went to work on the sugarcane and pineapple plantations in Hawaii. But to pay for their passage over, they would have to work as indentured servants. And the situation quickly became something that more resembled sharecropping, where you could work for many, many years and still never quite pay off your debt. And the work was very, very hard, and there were little opportunities to escape that lot in life. The situation was a little different for those on the mainland. This is Virgil Nishimuro Westdale, who grew up in just outside of Sturgis, Michigan. He lived in White Pigeon. And Virgil, before the war, was pursuing his dream of being a pilot. He had, here he is, he's the little boy here on the end. And while at Western Michigan University, he received his private pilot's license, and he was able to become a flight instructor, and he was training Army Air Corps pilots when he received notice that by order of the president, he was to report to Camp Custer. And he would be demoted from a flight instructor to that of a private in the infantry. And I don't have a photo of Tetsuya Sasimoto, but I do have his draft card here. And I have spoken with his daughter, and he was working as a something that we no longer use, but at that time, a chick sexer was basically an art form that was developed in Japan and then brought to this country by Japanese Americans. And the Japanese had discovered how to tell the sex of newborn chicks, which could save chicken farmers a lot of money, because they wouldn't invest so much in the chickens that were going to not lay eggs. And so that's what he was doing. And he eventually ended up settling in Zeeland, Michigan. So you have people who are just living their lives, whether it be in Hawaii or the mainland, when Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. And this really changes, it has devastating effects on the Japanese Americans in both places, in both the mainland and in the territory of Hawaii. For those on the mainland, here we have the Mochida family. They're waiting to be evacuated. And the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, it's disturbing that it's disturbing to me that when they entered camp, they were given a family number, and that's basically how you were identified, is with that family number. And in this photo, you can see some of the younger children wearing their family number around their neck, and that's and you know, it's hard to imagine that that's what happened to American citizens during that time. Now, when we talk about the Nisei soldiers, and we talked about the units and the men that made up the units, but now we're going to talk about their pathways to Michigan. And one of the major forms of Japanese Americans coming to Michigan was the migration from internment camps in search of employment and educational opportunities. You could get a leave from the camp for employment purposes, if the FBI had conducted an investigation and it was found that you know, you were not someone who was suspicious or in danger of harming the United States. So you could find employment in regions that, due to labor shortages because of the war, you could come to Michigan and you could pick fruit. You could do whatever was needed at that time, as long as you got that approval. Another reason was reunification with family who had already relocated to Michigan from internment camps. So not every job would bring a whole family to a state or a region. So oftentimes people in the internment camps, they would take opportunities that would bring their families closer together. Another way that the Nisei came to Michigan was through military service. We already mentioned the Percy Jones Memorial Hospital, which would later become the Hartdole Inouye Federal Building. But there's also Camp Custer near Kalamazoo, Michigan. And many Nisei soldiers actually went through Camp Custer before finding themselves in the European theater of war. And then the least common would be to actually be born and raised in Michigan, or at least raised in Michigan. which is what Virgil Nishimura Westdale's story started. Okay, so speaking of labor and leaving the internment camps and coming to Michigan because of the war relocation authority, here we have, a lot of people like to say that it didn't really apply to Michigan, or they think of it as being a West Coast subject. But here's an article from the Grand Rapids Press that talks about the resettlement and the founding of the War Relocation Authority office here in Grand Rapids. And the gentleman, William Kerr Stimson, he is the head of the War Relocation Office that was located at 54th North Division. They were located in 309, the 309 Keeler building. And you can see a photo of that in the bottom right-hand side there. So they would work with farmers, with businesses, anyone who would be interested in internment labor. And that's where the Nisei that were already living here, they would work with this office basically for not just an income, but also, like I had mentioned, trying to find opportunities to bring their families closer together in order for reunification of those families. Here on the bottom left, we see the title, it says Japs in Fruit Belt, and that was talking about Japanese Americans harvesting fruit in Bangor, Michigan. They would have come through the War Relocation Authority office here in Grand Rapids as well. There was one in Detroit and there was one in Grand Rapids. The one in Grand Rapids handled all of the internment labor needs for the western part of the state. Now, the photo that we see in the top right of the slide was given to me by Carolyn Konoshima Kellner. Here she is approximately 13 years old in a one-room schoolhouse in Holland, Michigan. And she had mentioned that for her, that time in her life was actually not so bad. She said that she has really fond memories and that her experiences in West Michigan were very pleasant. And I told her, I said, she almost apologized, I'm sorry, but my experience was really, it wasn't so bad. And I told her, I think, first of all, never apologize for that. And second of all, I think it shows how her family, what they had gone through to protect her from the realization of what the family was going through. And we can see here another article from the Grand Rapids Press that is talking about the War Relocation Office. And it is talking about the closing of the office and how all of the activities would then be handled by the Detroit office at that time. Okay, we talked about the Percy Jones Memorial Hospital. So in the bottom left here, we see that the city had a Japanese American war era colony. And at this time, there was only a single lone veteran left there at the hospital. I mentioned the high casualty rates of this unit. And so it would make sense that a large Army hospital like the Percy Jones would have a large population of Nisei soldiers there. But for many, it would be their first time and possibly their only time coming to Michigan. So something kind of interesting and something that I didn't really think about until I saw this this article from the Grand Rapids Press And it talked about tropical flowers being sent here from Hawaii to a patient. And at that time, Hawaii was almost as, maybe even just as exotic as Japan. And so they're talking about a injured 100th Battalion soldier, but they're gushing over the beautiful flowers that were sent to the hospital for him. Now in the top right, we had mentioned the Hart Dole Inoue building being named after Senator Dan Inoue, Bob Dole, and Philip Hart. Well, here we see Dan Inoue. He's in the left of the photo, sitting with his head, with his back to us, but his head turned. Smiling is Bob Dole, and then standing on the left is Philip Hart. So all three of them had been injured around the same time during World War II. And all three of them were sent to the Percy Jones Memorial Hospital to convalesce. And it was here that they discussed what they would do after the war. And Dan Inoue had wanted to be a surgeon, but you can't be a surgeon with one arm. And so he was listening to Bob Dole, and Bob Dole had a plan, and he had talked about he was going to run for office. You know, first he was going to run for this office, and then he was going to run for that office. And all three of them basically discovered their political aspirations while all at the Percy Jones Memorial Hospital together. And as you may know, all three of them did go on to have quite distinguished careers in the Senate. And they also maintained the bonds that were created there. When Philip Hart passed away, Dan Inoue gave the eulogy. And then when Dan Inoue passed away, Bob Dole, who was in very frail condition himself, out of respect, mustered the strength to salute his friend's casket one more time. And it just it speaks to the bonds that were created during this time between these men that lasted for the rest of their lives. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about the soldiers with ties to West Michigan. First, we have Virgil Nishimura Westdale, who served in the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, which was the artillery battalion of the 442nd. Next, we have Mitsusuke Fujimoto, who was in the medical detachment of the 442nd. And then we have Takahashi K. Miyamoto, who, like Virgil, served in the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. And then we have next, we have a photo of an older Ted Yamaoka, who served in the Military Intelligence Service. The group photo is courtesy of the Nishimura Westdale family, and it is of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, and you can see Virgil in the bottom left. The next photo is of a gentleman who unfortunately did not return home. His name was Teruo Tabata, and he volunteered to fight out of Holston internment camp. And here he is with his nephew, Jeffrey. And this is the last time that Jeffrey would see him. He was killed on October 28th, 1944. And his family is living here in West Michigan currently. Okay, so we talked about the differences between the Hawaii Nisei and the mainland Nisei. Here is a photo of the same event on the same date, just two different angles. This is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team at Iolani Palace, when they were getting ready to leave for Hawaii for Camp Shelby for training. Over 15,000 people came to see them off. You can see in the photo that they have leis around their neck. But really what they have is they have the support, overwhelming support of their community. Whereas the Nisei soldiers from the mainland, they were leaving from either areas like Virgil from West Michigan that had really pretty much a non-existent Japanese community, or they were leaving for service from internment camps. And there were many in the internment camps that were angry with some of the Nisei for serving, because they felt that they were foolhardy for going to fight for a country that had thrown them behind barbed wire. Okay, so we talked about it being a segregated unit, and it's always said that there was Japanese American soldiers and white officers. But that can be a little misleading because many will think that it was almost, the white officers lauding over the Japanese American soldiers, but that really isn't the case. In the first photo here, we have Gordon Singles, who was the head of the 100th Battalion. And that next we have Alan Purcell. And then next we have someone who is obviously not a white officer. This gentleman is Captain Young Ok Kim, and he is a Korean American. And it was interesting because when he arrived for training at Camp Shelby, he was told that, we can get you transferred immediately. And he said, "What do you mean?" And the fellow soldier said, "Well, I know that Japanese and Koreans don't always get along, so we can get you transferred out." And Young Ok Kim stopped him and said, "I'm not going anywhere because they're Americans and I'm an American and we're going to fight for America." And I just think that's such a wonderful sentiment, and more truer words could not have been said. And then the next photo here is of Second Lieutenant David Novak. And David Novak was actually a Jewish American. And it was something that I had discovered only after reaching out to the Jewish community here in Grand Rapids. Part of the tale of the 442nd is one that entails the liberation of Holocaust victims. And so I was trying to find someone from the Jewish community here who could speak to anything on that subject if they knew anything about it. And while I was reaching out, I came across, I was introduced to Cheryl Siegel, and she did some digging, and it turned out that David Novak is a loose relation through marriage in her family. So that was something that took us both by surprise. And in doing a little more digging, we found that many of the quote unquote white officers were actually, many of them were Jewish. It would have been very difficult for a Jewish officer to take command over Caucasian soldiers, but that was not the case with the 442nd. So there's a lot of details that can be missed in the story of the 442nd if you just kind of just glance over it. But it's only in the delving deeply that we find all of these little nuances that really make this truly an American story. The next one after David Novak is Louis Schmidt, and he was from, he's actually from Michigan. And in his obituary, they said that he never talked about anything that he had done in battle, but to the end, he never lost gratitude for Nisei soldier, two Nisei soldiers that had saved his life in Italy. He had been shot in the lung, and two soldiers under fire dragged him to safety. And it was something that meant so much to him that it was actually talked about in his obituary. The next gentleman is Joseph Burns, and he actually did something that was, I think it says a lot about his character. He actually took the time to learn how to pronounce his soldiers' names correctly. And that gesture of goodwill was not lost on his men. And he became someone that the soldiers had just tremendous respect for. They had respect. Actually, they came to have respect for all of the officers pictured here. Joseph Burns was approximately, I think, 6'2", and so he would have been a towering figure to these men. But unfortunately, he lost his life during the battle, or during the rescue of the Lost Battalion. Lastly, we have General John Dahlquist. And when people think of the Nisei soldier story, if they do have ill will towards the idea of white officers with Japanese American soldiers, many of those ideas can come from the leadership of this man here. He, I think Captain Kim, Young-O Kim, said it best when he said, it wasn't necessarily that he had any issue with Japanese American soldiers. It's that he deemed all soldiers as a means for him to gain personal glory. And he said that he wasn't a coward. He was actually a man with a lot of individual courage. But General Dahlquist, his experience was that of a personnel man. In his 30 years in the military, he had no combat experience. And yet, even though he had no combat experience, he would overcommand the officers under him. He would direct orders at a platoon level, at a company level, and it would just cause a lot of unneeded chaos. It became so bad that the gentleman in the first picture here, Gordon Singles, would not answer his calls when he would continually call for updates during the battle. Alan Pearsall, the gentleman with the lei around his neck, one time was so furious with Dahlquist for coming down to the front lines and barking orders at him that at the risk of his own career, he pushed Dahlquist and told him to never come down to the front lines again. All of the officers were extremely loyal to their men, and their men were extremely loyal to them, and to the point that they would challenge the orders of a general if it meant the safety of the men under them. And that point would be made very clear during one battle in particular, and that is in the battle for Briere. Here you see the city with hills in the background. The city is actually surrounded by 5 hills, and the hills are also covered in dense forest. The natural geography just serves as a protective barrier to taking the town. So much so that not since the days of the Romans has an advancing army been able to push out a dug-in force, which is exactly what the Nisei soldiers did during World War II. And after the Battle of Briere, speaking of Dahlquist and his ambitions, and proof that it wasn't just the Nisei soldiers, but all of his soldiers that were, I guess, to be used for his personal glory. Shortly after the Battle of Briere, he would push a unit of the 36th Division. It was the 141st 1st Battalion of the 36th Infantry. He pushed them so hard and so fast that they had gone far beyond the artillery support, and they became cut off from the rest of the U.S. forces by the Germans. And here we can see this is the pathway through some of these forests here surrounding Briere that made it possible for this unit to become cut off from the rest. The Germans had been entrenched in these hills for years, and so they knew the area far better than the American soldiers, and they were also able to dictate which routes they would have the Americans take. And it was on this road here that the 141st took, that where the Germans had cut them off. And you can see here, so this is where the lost battalion was located. And we have the American forces desperately trying to go from hill to hill to reach them. And to show you kind of the brutal fighting that they had to take part in, you can see here the thick, lush forests. And then look in the picture from that time, and you see just the complete destruction of the trees within that forest. And that isn't by accident. The German artillery was some of the best artillery, had some of the best artillery units in all of the fighting forces during World War II. And because they had been entrenched for years in France, 4 years at this time, they had developed a skill for creating tree bursts. So they would have the artillery hit right at the tops of the tree lines. And so now you'd have shrapnel falling down on you, and you'd also have just hundreds of wooden daggers coming at you as well. And it was instances of being hit by shrapnel and these wooden daggers that caused some of the high casualty rates of this battle. And the 141st was referred to as the Texas, the 36th, I'm sorry, the 141st Battalion of the 36th was referred to as the Texas Battalion because they could trace the battalion's roots back to the Battle of the Alamo. And so here you have, a very American battalion, one with, I guess an American legacy. And they are trapped, and their only hope is a unit made up of Japanese Americans who just not too long before were not even deemed fit to fight in the military. So it's just kind of ironic, the situation that they found themselves in. The battle to free the lost battalion would become known as one of the top 10 most important battles in U.S. Army history. And it was some of the fiercest fighting of the war. And the casualty rates reflect that, because over 800 Nisei soldiers lost their lives in order to save roughly 200 Texas soldiers. Some people will say that it's because the Nisei were viewed as cannon fodder, and so that they were disposable. But I think there's a very strong case that will be made that the Nisei were sent in because they were the best, and they were, if anyone could get the job done, it would be them. Remember, they had just taken the town of Briere, which was a feat that had not been done since Julius Caesar had did that years. I mean, during the time of the Romans. It's they were accomplishing things that no other units were accomplishing, and so regardless of race, you don't those types of the soldiers are not disposable. But if you have something that needs to be done, that's who you'd call in. Something also that came from this battle, the casualties were so high, but it really solidified the legendary status of the Nisei soldiers, and it won them the support of many of those in the military. And it's actually the military. It was fellow soldiers, and it was high-ranking military officers that really pushed for better treatment of Japanese Americans after the war. And it also, after the war record that they established during World War II, the Army really was the first government, agency, you could say, that was desegregated. You couldn't say that, that someone of color was a poor soldier when it was a unit made of Japanese Americans that became the most highly decorated. That argument could no longer be made. And then here we have a quote by General George Stilwell. Upon hearing of some of the just racist attacks on either Nisei soldiers returning home or the families of Nisei soldiers, this is what he had to say. He had said that the Nisei had bought an awful big hunk of America with their blood. And he goes on to say that that I say we soldiers ought to form a pickaxe club to protect Japanese Americans who fought the war with us. And he also then finishes it with, we cannot allow a single injustice to be done to the Nisei without defeating the purposes for which we fought. And it's true, in the European theater, they were fighting the worst white supremacist in the history of the world. They were fighting Adolf Hitler. And then to have these men that you fought alongside being terrorized or having their family terrorized by racist thugs would be a hard fact to swallow. Sometimes the acts of violence weren't physical. There was a VFW in Hood River, Oregon, that removed all of the names of not just the Japanese Americans returning from World War II. Not only did they not include their names, but they removed all of the names of the World War I veterans who of Japanese ancestry. And because of this, and because the reputation of the Nisei soldiers was starting to be told and be understood by not just soldiers fighting alongside the men, but within the ranks of all branches of service. Many other veterans were outraged, and there were a number of letters that were written to magazines, but also to other veterans groups. And here is a article mentioning the different chapters of VFWs that actually wrote letters to 2 Japanese Americans who had been denied membership at their local VFW. And you can see here, veteran groups in Michigan offer members to Nisei GI, and one of them was the VFW post out in Muskegon, Michigan. They had sent Private Naito an invitation to be a member of that club, and I thought that was just a proof of the, I guess, the good people that are out there in our community here in West Michigan. So here's I guess another connection that we have with the Nisei, but also with the Lost Battalion. The top left is Edward Dressel, and then there's another photo of him receiving a commendation award. And far right top, we see Virgil Nishimura Westdale shaking hands with Marty Higgins, who was the commanding officer of the Lost Battalion. Bottom row, we have another photo of Edward Dressel, and those are all courtesy of the Dressel family. The photo there in the article from the Grand Rapids Press shows John Dressel, who was the son of Edward, shaking hands with Virgil Nishimura Westdale because he wanted to thank him for saving his dad's life. And you can see the emotion on his face, and it just goes to show you the yes, there were so many losses, and many would say that it wasn't worth it. But Virgil himself would always answer that, ask the families of the men that we rescued, ask them if it was worth it. And the humility and the just service above everything else that Virgil and many of the other men displayed was it's just amazing to me. The last photo we have is Marty Higgins, and it's him cheering on a truckload of his soldiers after they had been rescued by the Nisei soldiers. Okay, so now we have Proclamation 4417, commonly referred to as an American Promise. And this was something that before delving into the story, I had no idea of President Gerald R. Ford's involvement in righting the wrongs of the Executive Order 9066. And this is a photo of an image of the proclamation, and in it he says, "We now know what we should have known then. Not only was the evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. We have learned from the tragedy of that long ago experience forever to treasure liberty and justice for each individual American, and resolve that this kind of error shall never be made again." Signed, Gerald R. Ford. And so this proclamation is responsible for, it actually rescinded the Executive Order 9066. And there was a lot of debate that went on back and forth about was whether or not this should be made. Many said that with the end of the war, that executive order was no longer valid, and so it would be a moot gesture or moot point, and that it'd be just a hollow gesture that could have possible negative consequences. And to his credit, instead of just taking a couple advisors' word, he just asked them to get more information. And some of the information that he received was from veterans of the 442nd. mainly Danny Niue, senator from Hawaii, and Spark Matsunaga, who was a veteran of the 100th Battalion. And they wrote letters of recommendation of this proclamation, and also many other Japanese American groups also wrote letters of recommendation. And for the nation's bicentennial year, and on the anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, President Ford signed Proclamation 4417. Additionally, I think the most famous and probably most important piece of legislation involving what I guess righting the wrongs of that time was the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It's been said that without the veterans of the 442nd, they said no veterans, no Civil Liberties Act. And it's easy to say why they make that argument, because Senator Inoue and Spark Matsunaga, although their families were not interned, they fought all of the battles within Congress to help overcome the hurdles in order for this act to pass. Spark Matsunaga personally went to all the other senators to personally speak to them and ask for them to back these bills. The bill that went through the House of Representatives was actually titled HR 442 to remind Congress of the sacrifices of the Nisei soldiers during the war. Additionally, many of the politicians from Texas, which is a very powerful state, they were reminded of the rescue of the Lost Battalion. And it was actually the Speaker of the House, Jim White, who allowed Congressman Norm Mineta to be the Speaker pro tem to introduce the bill. That's how much the passing of the bill meant to him. And additionally, and I didn't mention this earlier, but the members of the 100th 442nd, because of what they had sacrificed and for their rescuing of the Lost Texas Battalion, they were made honorary citizens of Texas. And that wasn't just a piece of paper, it actually carried weight. And it's because of the sacrifices that they made during that time that many of their fellow senators and congressmen got on board in helping to pass this bill. But once it gets the approval of the House of Representatives and of the Senate, it does have to head to the executive branch, to the White House. And the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, was a very conservative president. And there was a recession at the time. And part of the Civil Liberties Act called for payments of $20,000 to all those who had been interned. Therefore, Danny Niue and Spark Matsunaga, and also Virgil Nishimura Westdale, would not receive any of those benefits or the apology that was also issued because of where they were located. Their families did not face incarceration. But getting back to President Reagan, who was very conservative, and he had a recession that he was dealing with. It was not likely that he would approve the legislation. And it was actually not a well-kept secret that the advisors around him had said that there was a solid wall of no in regards to passing this. So since it did eventually pass, what changed, or I guess what was the deciding factor? And the deciding factor was when it was brought to his attention that while he was Captain Ronald Reagan, and if you recall the earlier quote from General Stilwell talking about other service members coming to the defense of Japanese Americans who served the country, Stilwell had actually called in the help of a very, well-known face, Captain Ronald Reagan, to speak to a family of a fallen soldier who was not allowed burial at the local cemetery where he lived. Stillwell was so angered by this that he flew out to the family in California and spoke with them and brought Captain Ronald Reagan with him, where Captain Ronald Reagan made this quote. He said, "Blood that has soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color." The soldier was Kazuo Masuda. So Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, I, representing all American families, want to thank you for what your son did. This story was brought to his attention, and he said that he remembered that day, and he agreed to sign the bill, and HR 442 became the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And the photo of him shaking hands, he's actually shaking hands at the signing ceremony. He's shaking the hand of Kazuo Masuda's sister. So from the organization of the bill to breaking through all the red tape in Congress, and then to getting the president to sign it, either the veterans directly or their legacy, their legend of what they had done during their time in service, was directly responsible for getting that legislation passed. And then lastly, in addition to, this is once again, Second Lieutenant David Novak, who is has connections here through Cheryl Siegel. Something that I did not know and that I had learned later is that the Go for Broke postage stamp, it took 15 years of a grassroots organizations trying to build momentum to get the U.S. Postal Service to issue the stamp. And one of those organizations was David Novak's grandson had petitioned some of the Jewish communities and the Jewish organizations to advocate on behalf of the Nisei soldiers. And he has been, and so his son has been honored by the Japanese American community for, taking up the call to help get the men of that unit recognized. And I think it also just speaks to something that I'm hopeful for, that the story of the Nisei soldiers, preserving it is directly related to to educating people about it. It is such a powerful story that to have it fade into oblivion is something that is just, it's not something that should ever happen, but we can only prevent that from happening if people outside of the Japanese American community start to share the story. And just like David Novak's grandson, I'm hoping that by sharing this story and with, in-person audiences and virtually as I'm doing now, that people will hear the story and they will see the value in it, and they will share the story as well. And it's only through sharing the story that we can preserve it. And to ask whether or not what they did was worth it. I think I would say absolutely that it is, because the stamp was issued in 2021, which was also at the same time as the rise in hate crimes against the Asian American community was starting to appear in the news headlines, and people were realizing that this isn't something from the past that we can never take for granted the sacrifices of our community before. And I just thought that it was a very fitting time to remember what the Nisei soldiers had done for this country. And so with that said, I just want to thank you again for your interest in this topic. And I hope that, you learned something, and that you will share with other people the story of the Nisei. Thank you for your time. And once again, I'd like to thank the Grand Rapids Public Library for giving us, for myself and Graf, the opportunity to share this powerful story from our community. Thank you.